What's up, guys? Chris here from Mainely. For Theory Thursday this week, I've been calling some of these things extensions of the Goldilocks theory, but this is more just kind of talking about pocket dynamics. And what I want to talk about this week is something I've been playing with for really a year now. Is the idea of a catch point in your stick. And that's really the best word I've found to describe it. But to just immediately show you straight up what a catch point to me means is, so I have the classic NOS that a lot of you know and love so well. Hopefully love. At least most of you know it. And the beauty to me of this pattern is that it's essentially a mid that can bag pretty low, and if for those of you who have used it, you've found that it ends up not incredibly defined, but when you're shooting with it, it doesn't just scoot out, it has a little extra whip, and that's because of the tension in the stacked SI creating what I call a catch point. So you'll see, as I've mentioned before, what the easiest way to tell how much whip a stick has is by the angle right here of the mesh as you run your fingers through it, as the ball is coming out. As the more gentle this angle, the less whip a stick is going to have. Obviously, if you have a stick and it looks more aggressive in the Epic Hawk, but you have to keep in mind it has a laid back profile. So if you see here, that angle is more steep than the NOS, which would imply that it has more whip. Like I said, this has the laid back profile, so it actually ends up having just about the same. But what happens is when you're passing and catching, that's the equivalent of kind of running your hands through the stick pretty easily. When you shoot, though, especially once you start shooting above 70, above 80 miles an hour, then the idea of a catch point comes into play. And what I mean by that is, as you see, if I really push in and drag my hands up, there's this secondary catch point before it releases out, where you see the stacked SI is completely stretched, and you see how there's a steeper angle now to the pocket. So if I punched it out here, it's almost like I could advertise it as a mid-high, but we all know that's not where it sits. It sits at a mid or a mid-low. So it's what people are going for when they say shifty pocket. A shifty pocket just scares me a little, because you have to be so careful with it. So when you really wind up, it will have, depending on the elasticity of the mesh, and this is otter mesh, so it's not going to be crazy, but with string king or a nylon base that has a little more elasticity, you're going to find that it will catch just a little bit more when you're shooting than when you're passing, and so that allows you to have very little whip when you're throwing and catching, but just that little bit extra oomph to really get a good full rotation shot when you really want to shoot. And so to show you, when we're designing our heads, some of ours involve more of a catch point than others. So for example, the Hawk, since it's a high pocket, we wanted a pattern that would allow you to really crank. So this is still a low whip pattern for passing and catching, and most of ours, I'm not a big fan of a crazy whip stick, and my college coach had a great drill where you would do cross-field passes sideline to sideline, and if you couldn't make that pass in the air while following through, you had to sit out until you got a new stick that had less whip. And I truly believe that passing and catching, you should be able to follow through on your passes and catches, and you need to have little enough whip to facilitate that. But obviously, if you really want to shoot at high velocity, you need to have a little bit more extra whip when you're shooting. So, so we design all of our pockets to have a decently minimalistic amount of whip. But for some of them, we're adding this catch point, and others we're not, depending on what type of player the head suits best. So for this hawk, you'll see it sits at a nice mid-high, but then it has a really nice catch point there, and that's going to allow it to hold on a little bit longer. And we even crank down on this shooting string up top. I'm going to loosen that up just a little to really make sure it comes out with a good amount of whip when you're shooting, especially with a laid-back profile. It's something you have to be careful of, because a laid-back profile can affect that catch point idea. For those of you wondering why your Maverick metrics don't shoot as hard as you'd like it to, we'll talk about that later. On other sticks, so on this Clutch Elite High School, I don't necessarily think of players who use the clutch as much of crank shooters. I think of them as more, when I think of the clutch, I think of more attackmen. It's the head Rob Pennell used in college. Josh Dion, I believe. I feel like I always think of a Duke attackman with a clutch. But so you'll see here, definitely a mid-low pocket. And the catch point is less intense here. So the difference between here, which is your normal amount of whip, and here is not nearly as extreme as the difference between here and there. So this is going to have a decent amount of whip and not crank quite as much when you're shooting. I mean, with any channel, a channel kind of creates a natural catch point depending on the elasticity of the mesh, but it's not just the channel. And you'll see that really exemplified in this head, which is one we just strung up, which is the Evo 4X6, where it starts here, and actually that's not quite the best example. Hold on to me as we go. I'm not leaving you forever, I swear. I'm not dead yet. I'm not dead yet. Help. Help. I got it. I got it. I got it. I'm coming back. I'm coming back. I'm coming back. Who needs editing? Not I. So, perfect example of this. Surgeon 10-500, mid-low, and then you'll see it really doesn't, it almost forms a catch point there, but it releases pretty quickly right into the shooting strings, which allows us to just be incredibly consistent. Now, do you need a catch point in your stick? No. You have to understand what your playing type is. For me, I have never been a 10-yard, 15-yard crank shooter. As much as everybody would like to be, sometimes that's not our role on the team. I was an ex-attackman, it's very rare that you're gonna see attackmen in college taking a rip outside of 10 yards, outside of 8 yards even. So for someone like that, it can almost be better to just try to make a pocket with less of a catch point, so that your motion, it's a way you can actually facilitate your shooting motion. So instead of having a catch point and being worried as an attackman trying to get a shot off quickly, I almost swore there, trying to get a shot off quickly, but knowing that you have this catch point in your stick and having to wind up extra far, it can be nice to have a more consistent pocket where you train yourself to abbreviate your shooting motion, getting the shot off more quickly. So it really depends on the player, and it depends on what type of shooting motion you have. So as a basic rule, attackmen would be less likely to have as much of a catch point. Middies or attackmen who are expecting to shoot outside of 10 yards, you really want to be focusing in and making sure you have a pocket that throws with little whip when you're catching and shooting and has a little bit extra when you're passing and catching, and has a little extra when you're shooting. And defenseman really doesn't matter unless you're an LSM who's cranking a crazy shot. So that's just the tip of the iceberg there. It's something I struggle with every head I string. And there's no theory of everything, obviously, but that's the initial idea. Yeah. If you learned something, or if you have any opinions that you'd like to add, please comment down below. Thanks for listening to me rant, and I'll catch you guys next time.